Let's try to understand what is a ledger and the history behind it. What is a ledger? Ledger is basically, back in the days, whenever I do a transaction, I'll probably write it in a book, which we call it bookkeeping, right? So we write each transaction. I gave, $100 to my friend, and this is the date I did that, right? And if I have done some transaction, I'll probably start writing on my book. And at that time it was all private books, right? So if I have taken money from somebody, he has written in his book, I have no visibility into it, right? So there is no visibility into this transaction that has happened there, and he has whatever he has written there. Again, I have to trust my friend that he has written the right stuff there. And also, when I want to search back into these records or these transactions, it's very difficult because you have to probably go through multiple books to know what's happened. And then at the same time, imagine having 10,000 transactions. Imagine the space it would take to write in all these books, right? There's a lot of physical space that you need to have to record all these transactions. So over the course of time, these things have evolved, right? We have the technology coming in. We have solved the search issue. Today, if I search for a transaction, it takes milliseconds to find an answer when and how it has happened. And if I want to store transaction now, thanks to whole digital era where we can store plethora of transactions without occupying so much space. But there's one thing that is still not being solved, that is trust and also transparency. So for example, if a company is doing a transaction with A company and doing a transaction with B company, the bookkeeping is still quite private, right? There's no transparency in this company to this company saying you have done a transaction there. So both of them basically updates their books saying, hey, there's a debit in this book and there's a credit in this book. We can always call it as ledger. Again, you have to trust the other person. What if this guy doesn't do that debit transaction or a credit transaction? You have to basically trust the other guy. So this is where the whole confusion comes in, right? If I've done a transaction, I've sent money to somebody else, I basically have to share my UPI receipt, and you have to trust me that I have not tampered that UPI receipt, right? If I can tamper and say, hey, I've done this transaction, there's no way for you to validate whether this transaction was correct unless you go to a bank. Now, this is where the distributed ledger comes into play, right? Distributed ledger actually solves two very important things. One is transparency. If I have done a transaction from one person to the other person, I don't need to now show my receipt, which is only very private to me, right? I can directly share a link to the transaction on the blockchain, which can be validated by everybody, right? Everybody can see that, hey, Sid has done a transaction with a person B, and this is the proof of that. And not just that, if two big companies are doing transaction, it is now recorded in history in that blockchain. Similarly, now when you talk about the trust factor, right? Now I don't need to trust anybody, right? You don't need to trust me onto saying I have done this transaction. The trust is the network, right? Network is the truth. And that changes everything. So if a business institute does a transaction with another institute, is there on the blockchain, and because this blockchain is built on trust, you'll completely believe in it that this transaction has happened, and that's the proof, and which you can obviously dig back to when it got started. All the history is there on this blockchain, and each and every transaction is recorded in this blockchain. When you talk about transparency and the importance of that, let's look back, right? Imagine we have mined 1 kg of gold. Do you know the history of that 1 kg of gold? Do you know where all it went, who bought it, who sold it, and how did you get it, right? So if you see, it's not at all transparent, right? You can't track this gold that has changed different hands and finally came to you, right? But now when you think about Bitcoin, you have a history of all transaction. You have history of all the tokens that has been mined, right? So even when the last token that will be mined in 2142, right, you have the complete history of the century of where this Bitcoin went, each transaction that has happened here. And that transparency by itself brings a lot of trust in the system, that brings in a lot of potential in the system. And that's why people cannot misuse this, or create a Bitcoin out of nowhere and try to fake things or try to do things, because everything of that Bitcoin is recorded in those ledger, which is going to be there forever.